Thomas Drake, the billionaire CEO of Summit Airlines, stood in the luxurious VIP lounge, surrounded by his business partners and associates. His sharp suit and polished shoes gleamed in the soft, ambient light of the room. The high-end glass windows overlooked the runway, showcasing private jets and luxury flights. To anyone who looked at him, it was clear. Drake was someone important, someone who owned the world. His confidence was unmatched, and he knew it. Isaiah Mitchell, on the other hand, sat quietly in the corner of the lounge, a small but unnoticed figure in the vast, well-decorated room. He wore a simple, well-tailored suit that didn't stand out as much as Drake's extravagant outfit, but it was clear from his posture and presence that he wasn't just another passenger. He had the air of someone who was used to being in control, even if no one else knew that. As Drake laughed loudly at one of his jokes, a few heads turned in admiration. He basked in the attention, relishing the power that came with being at the top. That's when his eyes briefly landed on Isaiah. Isaiah didn't stand out in the crowd. He wasn't trying to. But there was something about him, a calmness in his demeanor, a quiet confidence that most people missed. He was sitting alone, minding his business, yet something about the way he held himself made him seem far more important than anyone else in the room. It didn't take long before Drake's sharp eyes picked up on this. He had always believed that appearances mattered more than anything, and so far, he'd always been right. He looked over at Isaiah again, his gaze now full of disdain. To him, Isaiah didn't belong in a space like this. In Drake's world, people like Isaiah were meant to sit in the back, not in the VIP lounge where the elite gathered. He couldn't help but pass judgment based on the way Isaiah dressed and carried himself, as if it told the whole story of his life. In an instant, Drake decided it was time to remind the young man of his place. Without missing a beat, he turned to his assistant and waved his hand dismissively. "Take him to the back area," Drake said, pointing at Isaiah with a flick of his finger. "He doesn't belong here." The assistant, eager to please the powerful CEO, hesitated for a moment, but then walked over to Isaiah with a polite smile. "Excuse me, sir," the assistant said, his voice warm but firm. "I'll have to ask you to move to the back. This area is reserved for VIP guests." Isaiah looked up calmly, his expression unchanged. He gave a small nod, acknowledging the request. Without a word of protest, he stood up and made his way toward the back of the lounge. He wasn't offended, at least not outwardly. His thoughts were focused elsewhere. As he walked, he took in the grandeur of the space, noting the difference between this lounge and the one he had built, the one he owned. To Isaiah, this wasn't a moment to feel insulted. It was a moment of quiet reflection, a reminder that some people were still blind to true worth. As Drake continued his conversation with his partners, he had no idea that the man he had just humiliated was about to turn his entire world upside down. Isaiah walked slowly through the spacious lounge, his eyes focused ahead as he made his way toward the back area. As he passed by, the few passengers who noticed him gave brief glances, some with curiosity, others with indifference. No one knew who he was, nor did they care. To them, he was just another passenger, another face in a room full of wealthy individuals. The assistant who had spoken to him earlier led the way, walking just a few steps ahead. He looked back at Isaiah once, as if checking that everything was going smoothly. Isaiah didn't say a word, his face calm and neutral. He wasn't in a hurry, not bothered in the least by the situation. In fact, it seemed like nothing could disturb his peace. As they reached the back of the lounge, Isaiah noticed the change in atmosphere. The area here was less luxurious, less polished, a sharp contrast to the front of the lounge. There were a few other passengers, mostly business travelers who didn't seem to mind being in a more standard area. The space felt ordinary, almost beneath the standards of someone like Drake, but Isaiah wasn't fazed by it. It didn't matter to him where he sat. The lounge, the plane, even the entire airport, it was all the same in the end. What mattered to Isaiah was not the space around him, but the fact that some people, like Drake, would assume that their status made them better than others. He wasn't offended by this, but he was aware of the underlying truth of the world. Isaiah had learned long ago that power and wealth weren't the true markers of a person's worth. Meanwhile, back in the VIP area, Drake was enjoying himself. His loud laughter echoed through the lounge as he shared stories with his business partners, clearly at ease in the comfort of his wealth. The people around him nodded politely, hanging on his every word. He had always been used to the attention, and today was no different. As Drake looked around, he caught sight of Isaiah again, but this time his gaze lingered longer. He noticed that Isaiah was no longer in the front of the lounge where he had first seen him. He looked puzzled for a moment, but then dismissed the thought. Drake didn't think much of it. He assumed that Isaiah had left, perhaps in embarrassment or frustration. In his mind, the man didn't belong here, and it was only natural for someone like him to retreat to the back when they realized their place. The laughter continued, but something in the air had shifted. There was a certain smugness in Drake's demeanor, the kind of arrogance that came with believing you could control everything around you. He believed his wealth, his power, and his influence made him untouchable. He had worked hard to get to this point, or at least that's what he told himself. Isaiah, however, was still quietly observing from the back. He wasn't there to cause a scene, nor was he looking for validation. Instead, he was simply watching, waiting. There was no rush in him, no need to prove anything. The situation would reveal itself in time. What Drake didn't know, what no one in the room knew, was that the man they had just so easily overlooked had more power than they could possibly imagine. Isaiah Mitchell had always been a man of quiet strength. While most people were focused on appearances and social status, Isaiah had learned early on in life that true wealth didn't come from what you could show the world. It came from what you kept hidden. He grew up in a small neighborhood, far removed from the luxurious world of private jets and five-star lounges. But he always knew that one day he would make something of himself. Years ago, Isaiah had started his journey with nothing but ambition and determination. He worked his way through college, took odd jobs, and slowly built connections. It wasn't easy. Many times he felt like giving up, but he never did. Each setback became a lesson, each failure a stepping stone. Slowly, he began to understand how the world worked, how business worked, and how to leverage that knowledge to his advantage. Over time, he started making smart investments in small companies, all the while staying under the radar. He understood the power of patience. Every decision he made was calculated. Every move he took was designed to slowly build the foundation of a much larger empire. By the time Isaiah was in his mid-30s, he had amassed a fortune, enough to rival the richest men in the world. But he kept it to himself. One of his more significant investments was in Summit Airlines, the company that Thomas Drake proudly ran. Isaiah had seen the potential in the airline from the beginning, spotting areas for improvement and growth that others overlooked. He knew that, with the right guidance, it could become a global leader. So, he quietly acquired shares, made strategic moves, and slowly became the majority shareholder of Summit Airlines. Most of the people involved with the airline had no idea who Isaiah was. He preferred to stay out of the public eye, content with watching his investments grow behind the scenes. The power he held wasn't something he flaunted. Instead, he used it carefully, knowing that the right moment to step into the spotlight would come when the time was right. Isaiah didn't mind that people like Drake underestimated him. In fact, he used it to his advantage. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone. Isaiah had long understood that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned, sometimes without anyone even realizing it. He didn't need to wear a flashy suit to gain respect. He didn't need to make a grand entrance to be noticed. He simply knew how to get things done. As Isaiah walked through his life, he learned that those who lived their lives based on the opinions of others were the ones who missed out on the true opportunities. They were the ones too busy trying to impress others to realize what was right in front of them. While Thomas Drake might have looked down on him in the lounge, Isaiah knew exactly who he was. He wasn't the man Drake thought he was. He wasn't some passerby or regular traveler. He was the man who owned the airline, who owned a wealth far beyond anything Drake could imagine, and who had the power to change everything in an instant. But that moment had yet to come. For now, Isaiah was content watching the arrogant CEO continue on his path, unaware of what was coming. The plane had landed smoothly, and the passengers began to exit the aircraft, heading toward the terminal. Isaiah stood up, ready to leave the back lounge. His calm demeanor remained unchanged as he adjusted his jacket and began walking toward the exit. He hadn't made a scene when he was asked to move, and now he was simply going about his day. The staff who escorted him earlier had followed him quietly, still unsure of the true identity of the man they had just guided through the lounge. As Isaiah made his way through the terminal, a few of the airline staff members glanced at him with a little more respect than before. They had seen him moving through the corridors with quiet confidence and had begun to wonder about him. They couldn't place him, but there was something about him that made them feel like he wasn't just another passenger. Little did they know, the man they were watching was the one who owned the entire airline. In the meantime, Thomas Drake was still busy in the VIP lounge. He was laughing with his colleagues, feeling pleased with himself as always. His words flowed effortlessly, full of self-assurance. He had no reason to doubt his position in the world. To him, this was just another day in a life filled with luxury and control. As he looked around the lounge, he scanned the crowd. His eyes briefly landed on Isaiah, who was now moving away from the area. The CEO's brow furrowed in confusion. Where had he gone? For a moment, Drake thought he had just imagined the whole thing. But there it was. Isaiah was no longer sitting where he had been. The curious thought didn't linger for long, though. Drake assumed that Isaiah had simply left, maybe even fled in embarrassment. He brushed the thought away quickly. He had seen Isaiah's reaction when he'd been asked to move to the back. He must have been humiliated, feeling out of place. Drake wasn't concerned about the man anymore. After all, to Drake it was just another day of being in control, surrounded by his colleagues and friends. But then something unexpected happened. As Isaiah walked through the terminal, heading toward the gate, he was approached by an airline representative. The staff member had noticed the way Isaiah had been treated earlier in the lounge, and a quiet murmur of recognition was beginning to spread through the staff. "Sir, it's an honor to meet you," the representative said, approaching him with respect in her tone. Isaiah glanced up, offering a small, polite smile. "Thank you," he replied quietly, before continuing on his way. As he walked past the staff and toward the departure area, the momentary glances and nods of respect seemed to follow him. They knew who he was now, even if Drake had no idea. By the time Isaiah reached the gate, Drake was still oblivious to the truth. The CEO's ego hadn't yet been shattered, and his world was still firmly intact. Little did he know that he was about to face a reality that would change everything. He couldn't have known that the man he had humiliated only hours earlier was the very person whose name appeared on the ownership documents of the airline, the person who held the power to change everything in the blink of an eye. As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the airport shifted. Drake had finished his meeting, and the last of his business partners had begun to leave. He felt a sense of pride, as usual. Everything in his life was just the way it should be. He had made a few deals, laughed with some friends, and now it was time to relax. Life had been good to Drake, and he always thought it would stay that way. But something was different now. His assistant had been running around, checking on various things, and had suddenly approached him with a somewhat concerned expression on his face. "Sir, there seems to be a bit of confusion," the assistant said hesitantly. "There's a gentleman who, well, it's a bit difficult to explain." Drake raised an eyebrow. He was used to his staff handling things efficiently, but something about the tone in his assistant's voice caught his attention. "What do you mean?" Drake asked, not masking his irritation. He didn't like being bothered with trivial matters, especially not after a busy day. "The man you asked to be moved earlier. It turns out he's not just another passenger," the assistant replied, his voice low and uncertain. He's actually the majority shareholder of Summit Airlines. Drake froze. For a brief moment, everything around him seemed to stop. The words didn't fully register in his mind. He blinked, trying to process the information. "Excuse me," Drake said slowly, not quite believing what he was hearing. "You mean he owns Summit Airlines?" "Yes, sir," the assistant confirmed. "He is the one who owns the airline. He's been buying shares for years. He's the majority shareholder." Drake felt the blood drain from his face. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. He tried to shake off the disbelief, but it lingered. How could he have been so wrong? How could he have mistreated the very person who held the power over everything he had worked for? His mind raced as the realization set in. The man he had humiliated, the one he had dismissed with such arrogance, was not just a passenger. He was the one who controlled the airline Drake had worked so hard to build, the one who could take it all away with a single word. Drake could feel his heart pounding in his chest. His once confident demeanor was now replaced with panic. He had made a serious mistake, and it was too late to undo it. As the reality of the situation hit him, he stood up quickly and paced around the room, his mind working in overdrive. How could he fix this? What could he possibly say to someone with that much power? His arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable, had just been shattered. Meanwhile, Isaiah had already moved on. He wasn't concerned with what was happening in the lounge or the realization Drake was having. For him, the encounter was over. Isaiah wasn't the kind of man to rub his power in anyone's face, but he did know one thing. People like Drake needed to learn humility. It wasn't about revenge. It was about showing the world that respect and power were not always found in the places people expected. Drake paced around his office, his thoughts spinning. He could hardly believe what had just happened. The man he had dismissed so easily, the one he had humiliated in front of his colleagues, was the very person who owned Summit Airlines. It felt like a bad dream, but it wasn't. It was real. Every decision he had made that day, the way he had looked down on Isaiah, the way he had assumed he could push him aside, was now coming back to haunt him. His mind kept replaying the scene in the VIP lounge. Drake had looked at Isaiah with contempt, assuming he was just another regular passenger. But in reality, Isaiah wasn't a passenger at all. He was the owner of the airline that had made Drake who he was. And now, Isaiah had every reason to ruin him. Drake couldn't stop thinking about the power Isaiah had over his future. The minutes dragged on as Drake tried to gather his thoughts. He knew he needed to fix this. He couldn't afford to lose everything he had worked so hard for. His reputation, his position at the helm of Summit Airlines. It was all at risk now. But how could he possibly repair the damage? How could he undo the humiliation he had caused? Just then, his phone rang. Drake hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he was ready to face the consequences, but he knew he had no choice. He picked up the phone, and the voice on the other end immediately made his heart race. "Mr. Drake, Isaiah Mitchell is requesting a meeting with you," the voice said. Drake felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't hide from this anymore. He had to face Isaiah, and he had no idea what the man's reaction would be. Was he angry? Did he want to make an example of him? The fear that Drake had worked so hard to suppress was beginning to creep in. "Set it up," Drake said with a forced calmness that didn't quite reach his voice. "I'll meet with him." As he ended the call, Drake's mind raced even faster. What could he say to Isaiah? How could he explain his actions? How could he possibly make up for the way he had treated him? He had been so confident in his power, so sure of his place in the world. But now, everything had changed in an instant. The idea of facing Isaiah made his stomach churn. He couldn't help but feel small, like the man he had so easily looked down upon had suddenly become an untouchable force. He had no idea how Isaiah would react to him now. Would he fire him on the spot? Would he take over Summit Airlines, pushing him out of his own company? But as much as Drake feared the meeting, a part of him knew this was the moment of truth. Isaiah wasn't the kind of man to make decisions rashly or impulsively. He wasn't like Drake. He wasn't someone who would take pleasure in embarrassing others. The question was whether Isaiah would forgive him or take the opportunity to teach him a lesson about humility and respect. Drake took a deep breath and straightened up. He had no choice but to face the music. Whatever Isaiah decided, he would have to accept it. But one thing was certain. Drake would never underestimate anyone again, and he would do whatever it took to make things right, no matter how uncomfortable or difficult it might be. The time had come. Drake walked into the meeting room with a nervous energy he couldn't shake. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. For the first time in years, he felt small. Isaiah Mitchell was already sitting at the large conference table, calm and composed, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. Drake took a seat across from him, his mind still racing. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them was thick, charged with unspoken tension. Isaiah looked at Drake, his expression unreadable. Drake tried to force a smile, but it felt awkward and out of place. He knew he couldn't pretend everything was fine, not after what had happened. Isaiah knew the truth now, and Drake had no choice but to confront it. "I owe you an apology," Drake said at last, his voice hesitant. "What I did earlier, that was wrong. I didn't know who you were, and I should have never treated you that way." He paused, studying Isaiah's face for any hint of a reaction. Isaiah didn't respond right away. He simply watched Drake closely, his eyes calm and steady. Drake felt a wave of guilt wash over him. The man sitting in front of him wasn't just some passenger he could dismiss. Isaiah was a person of power, someone who had built something incredible from nothing, and Drake had completely misjudged him. "Do you know why I didn't correct you earlier?" Isaiah finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Drake shook his head, not sure what to expect. "Because I wanted you to see who you really were. I wanted you to understand that your actions, your arrogance, they have consequences, and sometimes those consequences come from places you least expect." Drake swallowed hard. Isaiah's words hit him like a punch to the gut. He thought he had control over everything, that his wealth and influence made him untouchable. But Isaiah had just shown him that there were forces in the world far beyond what money could buy. "I never meant to disrespect you," Drake said, his voice softening. "I've been caught up in my own world, my own success. I thought I could do whatever I wanted, that no one could touch me. But I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Isaiah leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Drake's face. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way that Drake had expected. There was no shouting, no demand for revenge. Instead, there was a quiet understanding in his eyes, as if he had already accepted Drake's apology, even before it was spoken. "I've learned a lot from this," Drake continued, his voice steady now. "Not just about you, but about myself. I've spent so much time focusing on my own power that I've forgotten the importance of respect, of seeing people for who they truly are." Isaiah didn't respond immediately. He simply sat there, letting Drake speak. The room was still, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. In that moment, Drake realized that Isaiah wasn't trying to make him feel small. He wasn't seeking revenge or even an apology. What Isaiah was offering was a chance to learn, to grow, to become a better person. "I hope this changes you," Isaiah said quietly, "because I've seen what people like you are capable of. You can either use that power to bring others down, or you can use it to lift them up." Drake nodded slowly, taking in every word. He didn't know if he would ever fully change overnight, but in that moment, he knew something inside him had shifted. He had been given a chance to become a better person, to use his position for something greater than his own ego. And that was a gift that Isaiah had just handed to him. Days passed after the meeting, and Drake couldn't help but think about what had happened. His life, his business, everything had changed in an instant. But it wasn't the kind of change that left him feeling defeated. No, this was different. He felt a quiet sense of renewal, a fresh perspective that he hadn't realized he needed. Isaiah's words still echoed in his mind, reminding him every day of what really mattered. It wasn't easy for Drake to adjust. His world had always been one of control, of power. He was used to getting what he wanted by sheer force of will. But now he saw the cracks in that way of thinking. Isaiah had shown him a better path, a path where respect and humility came before arrogance. He knew he had to do more than just apologize. He had to change how he operated, how he saw people, how he treated those around him. It wasn't long before Drake took action. He began spending more time with his employees, not just the high-level executives, but the people who worked on the ground, the ones who made the airline run smoothly every day. He took the time to thank them for their hard work, to listen to their ideas, and most importantly, to treat them as equals. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a change of heart. Slowly, Drake began to understand that leadership wasn't about being at the top. It was about lifting others up, supporting them, and making sure they had the resources to succeed. At the same time, Isaiah continued with his quiet work, managing his investments and expanding his businesses. He had no need to boast about his success. He wasn't interested in power for power's sake. Instead, he focused on using his position to create opportunities for others, to change the world in subtle but meaningful ways. He was always a step ahead, quietly orchestrating his next move without anyone noticing. One day, Drake decided to visit Isaiah again. He didn't want to just send a message of thanks through someone else. He wanted to speak to him in person, to express his gratitude for the lesson Isaiah had taught him. It wasn't about a simple "I'm sorry" anymore. It was about acknowledging the shift that had taken place inside him, about recognizing the responsibility he now had to make a real difference. Isaiah welcomed him with the same calm demeanor he always had. They sat down in the same conference room where they had met before. This time, however, there was no tension, no unease. The atmosphere between them was different, lighter. "I've been thinking a lot," Drake began, his voice steady but sincere, "about what you said, about how I can use my position to lift others. I've been trying to do better. It's not easy, but I'm making progress. I just wanted to thank you for opening my eyes. You've changed the way I see the world, and myself." Isaiah smiled slightly, his expression warm but knowing. "I didn't change you, Drake. You've always had it in you. Sometimes it just takes a bit of perspective to see things clearly." The words were simple, but they meant everything to Drake. He wasn't a perfect man, and he knew he never would be. But Isaiah had shown him that change was possible, and that with humility and respect, anything was achievable. It wasn't just about running a business. It was about being a better person, a better leader, and a better human being. As they parted ways, Drake left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't the same man who had humiliated Isaiah in the lounge. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that Isaiah's influence would continue to shape the choices he made moving forward.